My name's Scott Taylor, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado. Kathryn and I are working on looking at why black-capped and mountain chickadees interact differently in some places than others. So we're trying to understand why in areas that we disturb, so we change the habitat by building houses, or we clear the habitat because we're logging, why in those regions these two species of chickadees seem to interact differently than they do under a natural setting.
So my name is Kathryn Grabenstein, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Colorado at Boulder, working with Scott Taylor. I work with black-capped and mountain chickadees, and these two species have this really broad range overlap. So they overlap throughout most of northwestern part of North America. So all the way from New Mexico and then kind of a diagonal swath all the way up to British Columbia and Canada. And blackcaps and mountain chickadees, even though they have this massive area of overlap, as far as we can tell, they're only hybridizing, so they're only interbreeding in these really kind of very patchy, punctate areas. And so we're really interested in what's the context that's promoting hybridization in those regions. Why don't they hybridize everywhere, always, or every time they come into contact? Why don't they hybridize? So what's special about areas like Albuquerque or Boulder or outside of Laramie, Wyoming? Like, what makes those areas really unique that causes the species barriers between black-capped and mountain chickadees to break down in those specific areas? Species barriers are perhaps a bit kind of philosophical, but if you think of something like a blue jay, and then you think of another species like a Steller's jay, they look different, they act different, and so there's something that keeps Steller's jays, and blue jays, and that thing, the stuff, that behavior, that song, the way they look, the way they act, what they eat, where they hang out, we call that the species barrier. So it's something either before mating happens or after mating occurs that produces kind of sterile offspring, but it's something that keeps those two species from blending into one. So we don't see something that looks like out in the wild that looks half like a Steller's jay and half like a blue jay. We have Steller's jays and we have blue jays, and so there's something, which is the species barrier, that keeps them separate.
Species barriers break down when organisms don't recognize the other taxa as being different. So if an organism doesn't recognize differences in song, or they're unable to visually discriminate one species versus the other, then species barriers can break down. And if the genomes of those two species aren't different, or they're similar enough, then hybrids, or the offspring produced from one species and another, can actually survive and go on and reproduce themselves. So if you have hybrids, unlike mules, that are actually fertile and viable, they can breed with either parent species and then produce later generation hybrids, which leads to a breakdown in species barriers. So our hypothesis of what's going on with mountain and black-capped chickadees is that when humans change the environment, so when they cut down trees and the area regrows with deciduous trees or trees that lose their leaves in the winter, that changes distributions of resources that are really important for chickadees in terms of their overwintering success. And so we think that when those resource distributions change, that that can change the way that the chickadees are interacting.
Black-capped chickadees are always dominant over mountain chickadees, and females of both species really key in on those dominance interactions when it comes time to make their mating decisions. So it's very likely what I think is happening is these female mountain chickadees are watching male mountain chickadees kind of get over-dominated by these black-capped chickadees and saying, like that male looks really great, look how aggressive he is, he does really well at the feeder, maybe I'll actually mate with him instead of mating with my own species here, this mountain chickadee. These guys in the wild tend to be pretty elevationally separated, so mountain chickadees are found at higher elevations, black-capped chickadees tend to be found kind of in lower elevation, more deciduous, kind of like creekside habitat. And so I think that when people are putting up bird feeders in their backyard, there's this really awesome, great, readily abundant resource that both species are keying in on and coming in and interacting at those feeders. And now those interactions are then carrying over from this kind of non-breeding season, so in the fall and the winter, and then influencing females' mating decisions come springtime.
We study that in a bunch of different ways. We put out nest boxes in areas that are disturbed and undisturbed to see if we see differences in terms of who is building nests in urban versus rural areas. We band those birds so that we can follow them throughout the annual cycle. And then we also take blood samples from them so that we can sequence their genomes and look to see, how genetically distinct or similar they are and how that relates to this potential breeding between different species.
For me, one of the great things is if we can create kind of this network of interacting feeders where we can basically watch birds come to feeders and kind of see how they move through space. That would be essentially unprecedented in a wild population of watching both individuals and interact and kind of move across the landscape and watch whole genomes move across the landscape and watch that kind of interaction through both space and time. The fact that we're working with really common backyard birds is incredibly powerful. So our plan is to put feeders out in people's backyards. And so people from all throughout kind of the Boulder community will be really integral to performing this research, and will basically be monitoring their feeders and knowing the birds that come there. And I think really engaging people in not just telling them information, but having them be part of the scientific process is a really meaningful kind of component of this study. And then on like a really kind of broad scale look, I think when we think of people building cities and we think of kind of cutting down forests and a lot of the impacts that humans have, we often think in terms of kind of raw abundance. So how much of a species is there? And what we're looking at is not really how many chickadees are out in Boulder County, but we're looking at how two different species are having the way that they've interacted for tens of thousands of years, how those interactions are changing because of humans, and those are having really unintended consequences that most people don't think about. They think of the fact that when you chop down a tree, a bird can't nest in it, but they don't think that when they put a feeder in their backyard, maybe that's changing the really individual kind of mating decisions of the birds that come to those feeders. So I think there's multiple axes of kind of where this research is interplaying, both kind of at a local research level, the broader kind of Boulder community level, and then really stepping out to kind of the humankind as a whole.